The theme of the talk for this year has to do with the economy of Lagos. Specifically, the theme is the Lagos economy under the reign of King Kosoko, a tale of prosperity and the decline. So what we have to do here today is to x-ray the nature of the economy of Lagos during the reign of King Kosoko, and we'll also examine what the economy looked like after King Kosoko was deposed in 1851, and also after he returned to Lagos a few years after. The economy of Lagos has gone through different phases since Lagos was established in the 15th century, that is, in the past 600 years. During this period, Lagos has experienced a metamorphosis of sorts from a pepper farm to a mega city. When Lagos was established in the 15th century, the economic activities revolved around fishing and farming. And that was made possible by the geography of Lagos. Lagos is just by the Atlantic, and also it is also by the Lagos Lagoon and the Lekki Lagoon. The water area, the lagoons and the ocean created the environment for people to be able to fish. They were also able to farm because Lagos has land on the mainland and down to the interior. Which is why when we hear the statements from the pepper farm to the mega city, it is not a conjecture and it is not concocted. It arises from the fact that Aromire, one of the children of Olufolarin, who is credited for founding Lagos, planted pepper somewhere on Lagos Island where Igaidugoron is now located. So it is not just a mere comment that Lagos extended from a pepper farm and became a mega city over several centuries. What that means is that the people of Lagos engaged in farming in addition to fishing in the early period of the existence of the town. Lagos established contact with Europeans very early because of its location. The first Portuguese to arrive Lagos came in 1472. That was towards the end of the 15th century. The Portuguese engaged in informal trade. They bought products such as pepper, ivory, woods, which were used to make dye, gold, and other things they could find along the lagoons and the Atlantic. The Portuguese engaged in this informal trade, but in the years that followed, other Europeans joined. The English came in the 16th century and continued the informal trade that the Portuguese had been involved in up to that time. The British, Thomas Wyndham, sailed to the coast of West Africa, arrived Lagos in 1553, and then made it to Benin the same year. Many other Europeans came after this, and they continued the informal trade in pepper, in camwood, and all of those items they bought. Of course, they also brought European-made items during the period, and then cowries became dominant as the years progressed. The pattern of the economy of Lagos began to change in the 17th century when the slave trade became introduced. Slaves or humans were needed to work on the farms and in the mines in the Americas. And Africans were thought to be well suited for that economy. Arising from that, the slave trade began to take roots along the coast of West Africa down to Angola. And Lagos became a major player in this trade. Initially, it was wider somewhere in modern-day Benin Republic, in what was then called Dahomey, and Alada, not far from there, that were the main ports. But certain disruptions from there made Lagos to become important towards the end of the 18th century, such that Lagos then became a hub of the slave trade during this period. Some scholars, such as Christine Mann and Robin Law, have attempted to establish the growth, expansion, and importance of Lagos to the slave trade. For instance, in one of her works, Christine Mann writes, and I quote, "The momentous birth of this now vast metropolis, that is Lagos, will shape the lives of its inhabitants for decades to come, such as our lives today, can be traced to the time of slavery and abolition." End of quote. Robin Law draws similar conclusion regarding the impact of the slave trade on the growth and expansion of Lagos. It is important that slaves were not captured from Lagos. The slaves always came from the interior, but Lagos, because of its strategic location, became a hub for the exports of slaves. There is an island just along the lagoon here called Ide. That was one of the places where slaves were kept before they were exported to the Americas in the course of the 17th and 18th centuries, even up to sometime in the 19th century. Lagos witnessed a great deal of upheaval in the early 19th century. There were issues about succession to the throne of Lagos. But somehow, Lagos was able to overcome the succession disputes that characterized the period. King Kosoko of the Esilekun family became king in 1845. He was also an active participant in the slave trade. The British abolished the slave trade in 1807 because slave trade had become anachronistic in the world of that time. The Industrial Revolution began in England around 1750, and by the end of the 18th century, slaves were no longer required in large numbers. What was required at that time was a place where the British and other Europeans will get primary products such as cocoa, palm kernel, palm oil, and the rest of them for their industries, and markets where the finished products from those industries will be sold. Those were the main reasons for the abolition of the slave trade in 1807. However, after the slave trade was abolished, the slave trade still continued apace in much of Africa south of the Sahara. Lagos continued to be intensely involved in the slave trade despite the abolition of 1807. Just to give you a context, several analysts of the slave trade revealed that between 1800 and 1825, 251,906 slaves were exported through the Bight of Biafra, the waters, and a large number of these were exported from Lagos. But despite the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, from 1826 to 1850, 257,693 slaves were exported from the Bight of Benin. What that means is that there were more slaves exported from 1826 to 1850 than were exported from 1800 to 1825. So the Lagos economy under King Kosoko was dominated by the slave trade. Of course, there were other items that were also exported. Ijebu cloth came from Ijebu land, and several other items came from the interior that were also exported to Europe and elsewhere. But the slave trade was the dominant trade at this time, and Lagos became prosperous on account of the trade. So it is easy, therefore, to understand why Kosoko was resistant to attempts by the British to persuade him to abandon the slave trade. By the way, he was not the only one. King Gezo of Dahomey also, attempts were made to also persuade him to abandon the slave trade. For instance, Captain Forbes, British Captain Forbes, visited the courts of King Gezo and tried to persuade him to also abandon the slave trade. He too said, no thanks. When we look at the slave trade and our assessment of the trade at this time, that how could people trade in humans, and that the trade was iniquitous? Yes, we are right when we say so. But we will not be so right if we use the standards of the present to judge what took place in the 18th and 19th centuries. Indeed, in history, there's what we call presentism. Presentism is both an idea, it's an idea, it's also a fallacy. And as a fallacy, it means using the standards of the present, the values of the present, to judge what took place several years ago. So that is how we're able to understand why these leaders were interested in continuing the slave trade, despite the fact that when we look at it in the early 21st century, we wonder, how could people be so determined and desirous of a trade that caused so much pain to humans as at that time? So the economy of Lagos from 1845 to 1851, when King Kosoko was king, was dominated by the slave trade. Other items such as cloth, such as pepper, such as ivory, continued to be exported. But the slave trade was the heartbeat of the economy at that time. And records reveal that Lagos was prospering. From 1750, both Christine Mann, Robin Law, Akin Jogbin, and all the other scholars who have studied Lagos, studied Dahomey, and studied the states along the coastline, are of the view that by the first half of the 19th century, Lagos was very prosperous. And like I said before, it is then easy to understand why those kings were determined to ensure that the slave trade continued. King Kosoko was defeated after that war, 27th of December 1851. He took refuge in Ekpe, where he occupied one part of Ekpe after the intervention of the Awujale. History reveals that Kosoko continued his trade there. Incidentally, Kosoko himself, now from that point onwards, since the slave trade was now controversial and problematic, also began to shift to the export of other items apart from slave. Records reveal that. And many of the 3,000 who followed him there also engaged in other trade other than slaves. So Lagos was prosperous until Kosoko was defeated and left as king of Lagos in 1851. But there's a second part of the topic for this lecture, and that is the decline. So that raises the question, was there a decline in Lagos after 1851? Records show that there was no decline. The slave trade began to be reduced, and the British fought it. They established a naval squadron to patrol the waters, and by the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s, the slave trade had waned drastically. But was there really a decline in the economy of Lagos? Records incidentally reveals that there was no decline as such. Lagos made a transition from the slave trade to the trade in primary products towards the end of the 19th century. And this made the prosperity of Lagos to continue after 1851. The analysis of the economy of Lagos during this period reveals that there were many European companies, many of them, John Holt, UAC, and the rest of them, who also shifted to the trade in palm kernel, the trade in palm oil, the trade in cocoa, the trade in rubber, and before you knew it, Lagos adjusted to the change, such that one could not really notice a major downturn in the economy of Lagos. The economy of Lagos did not experience a toboggan slide on account of the abolition of the slave trade. John Holt, for instance, began to operate in Fernando and then moved to Lagos in 1887 and began to trade in all of these things and contributed to the prosperity of Lagos. Professor Anthony Hopkins, a major researcher on the economy of Lagos and the economy of West Africa, has a book that was published just a few weeks ago. The book, titled Capitalism in the Colonies, African Merchants in Lagos, 1851 to 1931, is an analysis of indigenous merchants in Lagos. Professor Anthony Hopkins highlights, analyzes, and establishes the impact of these indigenous merchants in Lagos on the Lagos economy in the second of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. Anthony Hopkins identifies 100 indigenous merchants, 100. And his conclusion is that these indigenous merchants made extensive contribution to the economy of Lagos in the aftermath of the abolition of the slave trade. Prominent among these were James Pearson Labulo Davis. You probably remember him. He was the first man to plant cocoa in Lagos around Agege side. Samuel Pierce, Josiah Doherty, Jacob Kehinde Coker, Candido Darocha, and several others who became prominent traders and contributed to the economy of Lagos in the post-1851 period. Indeed, Prince Abibu Ajaoki, who is the son of Buraimo Ajaoki, one of those who accompanied Kosoko to Ekpe, also began to participate in the trade. He traded in textile material, traded with the British, traded with the Germans, and also made his own contribution to the growth and development of Lagos. Of course, when you hear Abibu Oki Street, just the corner here, it is named after him. These were indigenous Lagos entrepreneurs who took advantage of the shift from the slave trade to the trade in primary products to engage actively in the trade and made their contribution to the economy of Lagos during this period. Therefore, it is difficult to say that the Lagos economy under King Kosoko a tale of prosperity and the decline. Lagos economy witnessed the rise and not the rise and decline. That is what the analysis of the economy of Lagos reveals. And those of us who have been in Lagos and Lagosians need to be grateful that this was the case. Because usually, when a dominant economic activity gives way to a new one, you witness a reduction in the economic prosperity before you begin to witness a decline. But in the case of Lagos, the transition was somewhat smooth, such that the economy witnessed the rise and rise. And the economy of Lagos has continued to, prosper along that line from that point. Of course, you probably are aware that the GNP of Lagos at this time is worth the next 6 states in Nigeria combined. In fact, the next 10 states, if you merge what they earn together, is not to what Lagos earns at present. So the rise began in the 18th century, and it has continued like that. Of course, Lagos too has experienced when there is a global economic crisis, such as we had from 1929 to 1931. Of course, Lagos too was affected by it. And when World War I from 1914 to 1918 was fought, Lagos too was affected by it. And when the Second World War from 1939 to 1945 was fought and the global economy was affected, Lagos too was affected. But on the whole, the economy of Lagos has witnessed the rise and rise from the 19th century, before Kosoko, during Kosoko's time, and of course, after Kosoko until the present, except for the spasmodic and episodic influence on the economy arising from global shocks at different times. Otherwise, the economy of Lagos has generally witnessed the rise and rise, during this period. A couple of things about the slave trade before I conclude. The slave trade, as we all know, we are not too sure of how many Africans were taken to the Americas. Some figures say 12 million, some say 20 million. But when we look back to analyze the slave trade and its impact, we know that the impact of the slave trade on Africa was negative. And so we are grateful that Africa south of the Sahara and Lagos especially was able to make that transition from the slave trade to the trade in primary products in the second half of the 19th century. Lagos, like I said before, was not a source of slaves. Slaves came from diverse places from the interior to Lagos. Lagos only capitalized on its strategic location, such that slaves were taken away from here and all. But if we look at the impact on the communities where the slaves came from, the impact was really negative. You are probably familiar, I mentioned the name before, James Pinson Labulo Davis. He was one of the greatest Lagosians of the 19th century. He was born in Batos in Sierra Leone. He was also the children of recaptured slaves. His father was from Ogbomoso, the mother from Abeokuta. He moved from there to Lagos and then joined the British Navy. He was even among those who fought against Kosoko in 1851, but after that encounter, he became an active supporter of the locals. He began to, establish farm. Like I said, he was the first to establish a cocoa farm in West Africa, beginning in 1879, from the cocoa seeds he got from Fernando Po and some from Brazil. And of course, from there, he spread to other places. He was engaged in several other trading activities during the period, and he became very prosperous. He was a very good friend of Thomas Babington Macaulay. You probably also know him, who established CMS Grammar School, the first secondary school in Nigeria in 1859. He was said to have given 50 pounds to start, and later gave him 100 pounds. 100 pounds at that time is about 3 million naira in current, or maybe even more, with devaluation at this time. Now, the experience of Labulo Davis shows how the slave trade was detrimental, and how trade in so many other things, other economic activities, were just fine. If his parents had been taken to the New World, all the extensive contribution he made wouldn't have been made. The experience of his wife, Aina Sarah Force Boneta, was even more dramatic. Aina Sarah Boneta was born in Okeodon, in what used to be Egbado, now Yewa, She was a princess, the daughter of the king of Okeodon. But King Gezo of Dahomey invaded Okeodon in 1848 and captured her, a 5-year-old girl, and took her to his palace, where she was from 1848 to 1850, when Captain Forbes visited the king of Dahomey. She was to be sacrificed that day, but the Captain Forbes pleaded for her to be released to him. She took Aina, Sarah Forbes Boneta, to England and gave her to Queen Victoria. Queen Victoria looked after her, brought her back to Sierra Leone to attend school, and then she became very, prominent. Incidentally, James Benson-Awoyinka Davis got married to her at Brighton, in 1862. Records show that that was the most prominent wedding held by people of color in England up to that time. Now, look at the story. A girl born in Okeodo, who was a princess, the parents killed, taken to the court of Dahomey, was to be executed. And then Captain Forbes begged for her to be released to him, and he took her away. And see what that family later contributed to, not just Lagos, West Africa, and humanity. That is both James Benson-Awoyinka Davis, whose parents were liberated, along the waters, and then, settled in Sierra Leone, and then James himself came back to Lagos, settled down, established a cocoa farm, did other economic activities, and both of them, linked to slavery one way or the other, made that extensive contribution to humanity, Lagos, especially during their time. But as I said before, the economy of Lagos continued to prosper, contributed to by foreign companies like John Holt, UAC, that were prominent at that time, and indigenous entrepreneurs, as highlighted in the recent book by Professor Anthony Hopkins. So Lagos has witnessed a rise and rise since the 19th century, and Lagosians need to be happy that those who led Lagos at that time were able to understand the trends and adjust accordingly, and didn't do anything to specifically, make the economy to go down. Like I said, from 1800 to 1845, even to 1851, Lagos witnessed a whole lot of dynastic disputes. But none of those people targeted bringing Lagos down on account of their losing out in the contest for the kingship. So for that, we need to be grateful to Lagos leaders at that time, and of course, Lagos leaders until the present. So the economy of Lagos was prosperous under King Kosoko, based mainly on the slave trade, and with trading in some other items, but continued to prosper after him from that transition from the slave trade to trade in primary products. Lagos came to be called Liverpool of West Africa from the late 19th century because of its strategic location and the importance in helping to evacuate products to Europe. You also recall that in 1906, Lagos had to be merged with the protectorate of Southern Nigeria because of the realization that the rest of Southern Nigeria needed Lagos for the evacuation of the many products that were there in the interior up to that time. So Lagos continued to prosper, even after the former colonial rule was established in the place from 1861 onwards. What do we say? That we should be grateful to all those who have made contribution to the growth and development of Lagos, and that mere policies alone are not enough. You need the ingenuity and enterprise of people to be able to make the economy tick. And this has been the experience, this was the experience of Lagos under King Kosoko, and has continued to be the experience of Lagos since the mid-19th century. I thank you.